The .NET Core podcast is supported by our listeners who have become patrons. To see a full list of the patrons, or to join them, head over to .NETCore.show/patrons. Hello everyone and welcome to the .NET Core podcast, the only podcast which is devoted to .NET Core, ASP.NET Core, EF Core, SignalR, and not forgetting the .NET Core community itself. I am your host, Jamie Brockman-Taylor, and this is episode 20, Xamarin with Jim Bennett. In this episode, I talk with Jim about Xamarin and the .NET Standard. Jim, in his own words, is a senior cloud advocate at Microsoft, Xamarin certified developer, author of Xamarin in Action, blogger, speaker, father, and lover of beer, whiskey, and Thai food. So let's sit back, open up a terminal, type in .NET New Podcast, and let the show begin. First thing I'd like to say is thank you very much for being on the podcast, Jim.
It's my pleasure.
Is it okay to call you Jim, by the way, or would you prefer like James, or is Jim your actual?
So the only people who actually call me James is my parents and my wife. Everyone else calls me Jim. I keep trying to convince my parents and wife to call me Jim, but it's just not happening. Unfortunately, my dad's a Jim as well, so it gets very confusing.
Considering that I'm not one of those. So I was wondering if you could first just sort of introduce yourself a little to the very small number of listeners that I have that will have never heard of you before.
Yeah, of course. So as you say, I'm Jim Bennett. I'm a cloud advocate at Microsoft. So the team I work on, you can kind of think of it as almost like the people-facing part of developer relations. So Microsoft's got this awesome developer relations team that covers things like docs. We've got our online learning platform called Learn. We've got our MVP program, which I'm sure a lot of your listeners have heard of. And then we have cloud advocates, and we are kind of the people-facing side of things. So we work with developers, we meet developers where they are, and we try to make their lives easier when it comes to using Microsoft products or using open source software with Microsoft, or just anything we can help them with. And some of what I do is things like conference talks. So I'll go to conferences, I'll evangelize our products, spread the word, show off the things that we do. I work on things like our docs, our Learn platform to help developers actually get on board and use the tools that are there. I'm an engineer at heart, so I've got a strong background in Xamarin. I'm a former Xamarin MVP. I've written a book on Xamarin called Xamarin in Action, published by Manning. I've been a Xamarin developer for quite a long time. So I work with Xamarin developers. I work through the docs that we've got to make sure that they're friendly to our Xamarin developers. I create blog posts showing off the cool things we can do or helping people solve problems. I create sample code and I advocate for our developers. So I kind of like to think that I work for the developers and I fix Microsoft, if that makes sense. So when we have Xamarin developers who have problems, part of my job is to go back to engineering and say, fix it. This is not right. And here's why. And I can do that from the perspective of an engineer. So that's pretty much what I do. As I say, my focus is Xamarin and obviously Azure, because Azure is awesome. And yeah, I guess that's kind of the short elevator pitch.
Oh, fantastic. You've talked a lot about Xamarin there. You have talked about the book that you've written, Xamarin in Action. I'd like to come back to that later if we have a chance.
Okay.
Mainly because I've interviewed Dustin Metzger of the .NET Core in Action book, and by the time this episode goes out, I'll have interviewed Andrew Locke with his ASP.NET Core in Action. So it's kind of like the three related books that, I'd like to talk to you all about, and I have talked to those about. So if it's okay, we could circle back to the book at some point.
Yeah, of course. It's quite cool. We've all written books with Manning. The In Action name gives that away. Manning's a fantastic publisher. So it's very cool that we're all Manning authors that you're interviewing.
Could you give us a brief sort of elevator pitch or a brief idea of what Xamarin is for the developers who haven't used it before?
Yeah, so Xamarin at its most basic is .NET wrappers around the iOS, Android, and macOS APIs, SDKs, a .NET framework style implementation that runs on those platforms, and then a tool chain that allows you to use Visual Studio to build apps for those platforms. So essentially what it means is you can build 100% fully native apps for iOS, for Android, and for macOS using .NET technologies, such as C# or F#. 100% API access, so everything you can do with Objective-C or Swift or Java and Kotlin, you can do using C# or F#, and then it compiles down using the native toolchain. So it uses Xcode under the hood. It uses the Android compilers under the hood to build a native application with fully native performance. It's basically Mac, iOS, Android, totally native, but using C# and F#. That's the very, very brief elevator pitch. Behind that's a lot more, but the very brief one is you want to build a mobile app with C# and F#, but you want to have access to everything. It's Xamarin.
So I guess you could have one code base that has your business logic, maybe a separate code base or the same code base with several different view systems. So you could have an iOS view and an Android view, and you just hit build and you get both out? Or is it that this project will have to have the Android view for it, and this project will have to have the iOS build?
It is pretty much what you say. You have multiple projects. You have an iOS app, and that is fully accessing the iOS SDKs, and in there you define your views, and these views you define exactly the same way as if you're using Objective-C or Swift. So things like storyboards, you can design a storyboard, you drop that in, and you can use that, and you create your view controllers the same as you would do with Objective-C or Swift, but you do it using the C# wrapper around the underlying Objective-C UI view controller class. On Android, same kind of idea. You can create your layout XML, you can create your resources, the same as you do in Android Studio, but then you define your activities or your fragments using the C# wrappers around the underlying Java activity and fragment classes. And that's at your view level, but the rest of your code you can essentially share. So the implementation of Xamarin on iOS is a .NET Standard compliant framework. Same on Android. It's a .NET Standard compliant framework. So you usually end up with another project, which is your core business logic code. It's basically everything that doesn't need to access the native APIs directly. And that code is shared. So it's compiled down to IL, and that IL is then used by your iOS project and compiled using Xcode down to native LLVM bytecode for iOS, or it is compiled to IL code and then JITted on Android. So you end up sharing pretty much anything that doesn't need those underlying native APIs. Now, how much you share is very dependent on your project, but we typically talk about 60 to 70% code sharing between your two apps. And that's kind of the big ticket item. This is the massive reason for using Xamarin, is you write your code, the bulk of your code, you write it once, and then you share it between the two platforms. On top of that, the other sort of kick-ass reason for using it is it's .NET. So because it's a .NET Standard implementation, if you've got NuGet packages that you want to use, you can use those. There's a kind of whole world of NuGets that you can use inside your apps and use on both iOS and Android. So one good example would be JSON parsing. So if you think about a lot of mobile apps, they usually talk to a server, they download some data. And in a lot of cases, you make a call to a REST API and you download some JSON. Now, if you're writing that in Objective-C, you would use your NSURL session, you would download some code, you'd have a JSON parsing library that does things in a certain way. On Android, again, you'd have a different way of making that connection to the REST API. You'd download some data, you'd handle the JSON in a different way. And sometimes you can kind of end up with quirks around things like dates or different representations where your data doesn't get treated in exactly the same way. If you do this with Xamarin, you'd use HTTP client, same code on both platforms, and under the hood, it would use the native implementations for making network calls. And then you just use Newtonsoft.json to deserialize the JSON. So you know that the JSON is being deserialized in exactly the same way on both platforms. So it's just really, really good that you've got this huge ecosystem of tools. You've kind of got this consistency between two platforms. You're writing your code once. You're fixing your code once. If you've got bugs, you know things are going to work the same way.
I see. How does that work with debugging then? So let's say I want to debug on a piece of hardware and I connect it to my computer, I run the debugger and I put a breakpoint in. Is there lots of magic wizardry that happens that converts code on the way to the device and back from the device? Or is that just not a possibility?
Oh, it's totally possible. It's totally possible. All that magic is there. It is a full debugger experience. The only thing you don't get, which some of our listeners who are used to things like certain desktop .NET implementations might think is things like edit and continue you don't get because the code has to be compiled and run on the device. But other than that, it's a full debugging experience. So I can stick a breakpoint inside some C# code and I can hit that breakpoint while it's running on an iPhone simulator, an actual iPhone, an Android emulator, an actual Android, and I can step through my code. I've got the full watch, immediate window, everything you want to do. So the way you build Xamarin apps is Visual Studio. Everything's done inside Visual Studio, the same as you would do if you were building a WPF app and running that on Windows. And you get the same level of debugging, the same kind of experience that you would see if you were doing a desktop application. And actually, one thing that Xamarin does that's really cool, and so as far as I know, Xamarin is the only cross-platform framework that does this, and this is amazing, and I love this, is you can actually debug an app running on your iPhone from a Windows box. Now, that in itself is just phenomenal. So Apple has a whole lot of restrictions around their SDKs. You're only legally allowed to build an app for iOS on a Mac. You have to run Xcode, you have to run the Xcode tools on a Mac. And Xamarin has this incredible way that from a Windows box, it can, behind the scenes, SSH into a Mac on your network, use the Xcode libraries to build, or the Xcode CLI to build your app on the Mac, deploy it to your iPhone, either over a cable or over Wi-Fi, and then debug it. So from the Mac, it uses SSH to Windows to run, to the Mac, and uses the full Xcode debugger, and you can step over code running on your phone via the Mac on Windows. So it's just this completely crazy debugging experience, but it works, and it works beautifully.
So that I understand it correctly, my Windows box would create an SSH to my Mac, send over the code, tell the Mac, go do the build, do whatever it is, get the response, then push it to the iPhone, and then somehow maintain a connection, this like juggling connection between the iPhone and the Mac and Visual Studio in order to do the debugging experience.
Yeah, it's exactly that. It's compiled to IL on Windows, the IL is pushed to the Mac, it's compiled down to the bytecode, deployed to your iPhone, and then you can debug it. And what's even cooler as well is if you don't have an iPhone and you want to use the simulators that come as part of the Mac, there are no simulators for Windows. The simulators only run on the Mac. But what Xamarin can do is Xamarin can actually screen share the simulator from your Mac to your Windows box. So you can, from Visual Studio on Windows, you connect to a Mac, and that Mac can be in the cloud. There's a service called Mac in Cloud where Macs run in the cloud, as the name kind of suggests. And from your Windows box, you can connect over the internet to Mac in Cloud, build your app, it'll launch the simulator in Mac in Cloud, screen share that simulator back to Windows, and you're debugging it as if the simulator ran on Windows. And in some ways, the simulator on Windows is actually better because on the Mac, there's no touchscreen. So when you're doing two-finger gestures on the Mac, it's actually quite convoluted. Whereas on Windows, you've got the touchscreen. So you just use the touchscreen as if it was the touchscreen of the iPhone, and you get a full multi-finger gesture experience. It's just bananas. Absolutely bananas, this. And it just works beautifully.
That really is amazing. I can't even imagine the amount of engineering effort has gone into that.
Yeah. There's so many smart people working at Xamarin making this work. It is incredible. It's absolutely incredible.
As someone who has never used Xamarin, my question to you, and I realize this might be a bit of a leading question, what would be the main difference between creating a Xamarin app? I feel like you've already answered this, but we'll ask it anyway. A Xamarin app and, say, a progressive web app.
So the big difference really is that Xamarin apps are totally native apps. And so by totally native, I mean it's native performance, it's native controls, and it's native APIs. So if you're building a progressive web app, yes, it can run on mobile, and there are ways that can access some parts of the hardware and some parts of the SDKs. Whereas a Xamarin app has got total 100% native API access. You want to build an ARKit app on iOS? You can do that. You want to build a sharing extension, a Siri shortcut? You can do that. You want to start tying into the Android alarm system? You can do that. Managing notifications, you can do that. Everything you can do on the native platform, you can do with Xamarin. Whereas progressive web apps, they limit the capabilities of what you can do. Now, it's not to say PWAs aren't a great thing. They allow you to do a lot of good things, but Xamarin just gives you everything. It's as if you are building with the native platforms. It's as if you're building with the tools that Apple and Google provide. You're just doing it in one language. And you can compile your apps, you deploy them to the store, exactly as you would if you're doing Objective-C or Java.
The full developer experience of, I have an idea for an app, all the way to people are using my app on real devices in the real world. That whole experience I can manage from Visual Studio.
Yep, you can build it, you can deploy it to the stores all from inside Visual Studio. And yeah, you can do everything. So at the next WWDC, when Apple announce iOS 13 with whatever cool, funky features it's got, you will be able to use all those features out the box. Absolutely everything as if you're building a native app. When Android Q comes out when everybody eventually gets that, well, I suppose everyone's still on Lollipop now, aren't they? But, when Android Q comes out and people get that, again, all those APIs you'll be able to use. So you've got that total control. That's kind of another way where things like Xamarin is better than tools like React Native or Flutter. So if you wanted to access those native APIs from React Native, it's a bit of a janky experience. Same with Flutter. You have to kind of mix the Dart with Objective-C or Java. And although obviously things like React Native has its upsides in terms of the way that it does all the JavaScript code if you're a JavaScript developer, and Flutter has its upsides in the way it builds its UIs, if you need the native access, with Xamarin it just works. On the other platforms, you don't get that same 100% native API access. Also, one classic example recently we're hearing with Flutter is because Flutter draws its own UI controls on screen, the whole accessibility model isn't quite as good as it could be. Whereas iOS, the native iOS APIs, has got phenomenal accessibility. It's brilliant if you're using it, if you're like a visually impaired person, for example. The way that iOS works is just fantastic. If you build with Xamarin, because you're using native controls, you get that accessibility out the box and it just works. Whereas with platforms like Flutter, there's a certain amount of work you have to do to get accessibility baked in. So if you want to take advantage of those things that make those platforms great, Xamarin is definitely the answer.
You're really selling me on Xamarin here.
It's great. And I probably should add, for the benefit of the users, yes, I work for Microsoft. Yes, my job is to evangelize Xamarin. But I do this job because I love Xamarin. I don't love Xamarin because I do this job. I was talking about Xamarin, blogging about Xamarin, writing about Xamarin before I had a job working for Microsoft. I just think it's a phenomenal platform. And I think one of the things I really love about it as well is Xamarin is a completely unopinionated platform. So it just wraps those APIs. That's it. And how you handle that is entirely up to you. So one example is the MVVM design pattern. If you have listeners who've done WPF or UWP, they've probably heard of MVVM. The MVVM design pattern is very popular for Xamarin. It works really, really well because it allows you to put a lot of your code in your shared code. You put UI logic in your shared code through your view models. But you don't have to use MVVM. You can use reactive UI if you want to. You can kind of use different ways of building your apps if you want to. You're not forced into one particular paradigm. And on top of Xamarin, it's very easy for people to build different frameworks to allow you to do different things. And one framework I think it's definitely worth talking about is Xamarin Forms. I don't know if you've ever heard of Xamarin Forms, but the idea behind Xamarin Forms is to provide a platform agnostic abstraction of the UI. So you think about what we talked earlier, you'd have your UI defined with storyboards or Android XML with shared code underneath. Xamarin Forms allows you to actually share your UI code. You define your UI with an abstraction, and you can do that in C# code, or you can do it in XAML. If you're of the WPF, UWP bent, you definitely want to do it in XAML. And then when you define your controls, when the app is actually running on the device, the controls are rendered using the native controls. So you say, for example, in your Xamarin Forms page, I want a button. And then when your app runs on iOS, it uses a UI button from UIKit. On Android, it uses the Android widget button from the Android widget library. So it uses the native controls, but when you define your UI, you do it using this abstraction. So you can end up with defining your UI once. And so you can ramp up that code sharing, the 60 to 70% code sharing. You can easily ramp that up to 90, 95% if you want to. And it's just a phenomenal capability. And you can easily mix and match. So you can say, I want to have a native app because I want to have access to all the underlying capabilities of the native platform, but then I'm going to do a few pages in Xamarin Forms using this abstraction layer. You can have a nice mix if you want to. It's just great. It's just a brilliant framework built on top of Xamarin. And it's actually got to the point now where, to a lot of people, Xamarin Forms is Xamarin. We're seeing 3 out of every 4 Xamarin developers using Xamarin Forms to build their UIs once. But they've still got access to native controls. They've still got access to native APIs. They can do absolutely everything you can do on the native platform, but you end up sharing 90, 95% of your code. It's just amazing what you can do with it. And then you can even go one step further on top of that if you want to. And there's a thing called Fabulous, which is an MVU architecture, a model view update architecture based upon Elm that uses F# to give an Elmish style architecture to Xamarin Forms apps. So because it's got this unopinionated Xamarin layer, and you can put Forms on top of that and Fabulous on top of that, or even Uno, which is built on top of Xamarin, you can kind of do so much with it. You're not constrained to, you have to build your apps one way. You've kind of got so much freedom to build the apps the way that works for you and the team of people that you're working with.
Wow, that's amazing. That's a lot of information, but that's amazing.
Yeah, sorry. As you can tell, I kind of love this Xamarin thing. So, so much great stuff about it.
So with the Xamarin tools, is it a case of I just want to target iOS or I just want to target Android? Or do I have to say I have to target Android SDK level 24 and iOS 6?
Yeah, it's kind of baked into the way that the iOS apps and the Android apps work. Because they are fully native apps, you have to follow the paradigms of the native platform. So when you create your iOS app, you have to specify what your base SDK is that you're targeting. And obviously then in your code, you have to say, if I'm targeting iOS 8, I can do X. If I'm targeting iOS 11, for example, I have to do Y as the SDKs change. Same with Android, you've got the same 3 compile version minimum and target framework versions that Android uses. And obviously Android users don't update their OSs very often because a lot of time they can't. So you have to support older versions. But you have that same level of, I've got to choose the versions that I support. You have the same kind of manifest files that you get on Android. So it is exact same as an Android app. But again, you've got that control. You can say, I just want to support iOS 12 because I just want the latest and greatest. And you get, your 60% of users, or I just want to support Android from Marshmallow and above for the new permissions model. You have that control.
I really like that. I think I'm going to have to start playing with Xamarin over the weekend.
It's really cool, and it's part of Visual Studio. So if you've got Visual Studio installed on the Mac, you'll have the Xamarin tools just installed by default. On Windows, you just launch the installer, and there's a mobile tools for .NET workload. You just tick the box, and it installs all the stuff for you, and installs the Android SDKs and the emulators, and will install the code to talk to your Mac to do everything for you. And actually, just going back to the Mac thing, what's cool as well is you don't have to configure your Mac. From Windows, it will connect to the Mac and actually push the relevant pieces to the Mac for you. The only thing you have to do from the Mac is install Xcode from the Mac App Store and launch it once to install the other bits, because Apple don't seem to be able to create an Xcode installer that works properly unless you run the app once. But other than that, you can just manage it all from Windows, which is very cool.
So, .NET Core and Mono are still pretty new-ish. Hardcore .NET developers are kind of Windows only, so being able to do it from an environment that they are familiar with, I guess, is pretty cool.
Yeah. So one big thing about Xamarin Forms actually is if you come from a Windows desktop background, so if you know WPF or you know UWP and you know XAML, you can literally launch Visual Studio, an environment you know well. You go File, New, Cross-Platform Mobile App, an experience you know well. You design your XAML. The names of controls are a little bit different because they behave differently. But you design your XAML, you write your code, you click Run, and you've got a mobile app running. Now, that's not to say that mobile apps are completely easy. They are very different. You've got memory constraints. You've got different UI paradigms because it's a small screen. But if you want to get started, if you can build a WPF app, you can build a mobile app, a cross-platform mobile app, inside the tools that you know and you love, using the languages that you know and you love. It's just absolutely bananas. It's great.
I don't know whether this is going to be a contentious question or not, but for the users who are still using Windows Mobile, can you target Windows Mobile 8, or is it literally just iOS, Android?
So for both those users who are still on Windows Mobile, so no, it used to target Windows Mobile 8. Back in the day, you used to better create a Xamarin Forms app for Windows Mobile 8, but that's been dropped. It's Windows 10 and above now. The Windows mobile platform's not supported, so no one at Microsoft's going to be supporting that platform, including the Xamarin developers.
I mean, that's fair enough. Like you say, they're not supporting the platform anymore.
Though saying about supported platforms, I do have to drop this in as to just how cool Xamarin Forms is. So, as I said earlier, Xamarin Forms is this UI abstraction. It sits on top of the native user interface for iOS and Android. But they've added a lot more platforms than just iOS or Android. With the Xamarin Forms app, you can target iOS, you can target Android, you can target macOS, you can target Windows by building UWP apps. You can target Linux. There's a GTK, we call it a backend. It's kind of the thing that makes it work. There's a GTK one that runs on Linux. We have one built by the community that runs using WPF, so it can run on Windows 7. And if you have a Samsung TV, Samsung Watch, or even one of those Samsung smart fridges, the Tizen operating system has said that the official platform for building apps on Tizen is .NET Core. The official UI platform is Xamarin Forms. So you can build one app, define your UI once, and run it on iOS, Android, macOS, Windows 10, Windows 7, Xbox, HoloLens, Linux, Tizen TVs, and Tizen fridges. One app running on all those platforms. I cannot think of any other technology that allows you to build 100% native apps across all those platforms. It's insane.
I cannot wait to push my first to-do app to a fridge. I have to just say that.
Seriously, I need to get my hands on one of these fridges that runs Tizen. I would love to go on stage and do a .NET Anywhere demo. Just say, look, here's on the phone, here's it on this, here's it on Xbox, here's it on HoloLens, here it is on a fridge. I'm not sure I could put a fridge in my hand luggage. Maybe check luggage might be a problem, but one day, I will show off a Xamarin Forms app on a fridge. I've been saying this for a year or so. I will do it. One day I'll put it on a fridge.
Fantastic. You've mentioned it a few times. You've said that Xamarin is a .NET Standard compatible framework. Is it Mono? Is it .NET Core? Is it .NET Framework? Or is it its own thing?
So Xamarin is based on Mono.
Okay.
So I don't know how much you know about the history of Mono, but one of the main founders of Mono is a very, very smart, awesome gentleman called Miguel de Icaza. And he was actually one of the founders of Xamarin. So he built Mono to put .NET on Linux. He then built, along with obviously the rest of the team, he built Mono Touch and Mono Droid to bring Mono to the iOS and Android platforms. And it's that became Ximian, that became Xamarin, that's now part of Microsoft. So everything's based on top of Mono. The framework, as it were, the .NET Standard compatible framework is based off Mono. It uses the Mono base class libraries for everything. And it uses things like the Mono linker and the various Mono compiler toolchains. So yes, it's all based on Mono. Obviously, if you're building a UWP app with Xamarin Forms, that will then use the .NET framework, with obviously the UWP parts of that. But when it runs on Linux with GTK, that uses Mono. On Mac, it uses Mono. So kind of Mono is the core behind it. And currently, it's all .NET Standard 2 compliant. And there's been .NET Standard 2.1 released or is releasing some point. And so Mono is going to be updated to support that.
It's the little framework that could, I think, is Mono.
Yes. Not so little. The big framework that could.
Well, okay, yeah. It was originally the little dream in Miguel de Icaza's mind that has somehow managed to take over the world. We've got Xamarin, we've got Unity 3D, we've got Blazor now. Yep. It's amazing.
It is. It's incredible. So I've often joked that the acquisition was actually Xamarin taking over Microsoft. And people say to me, no, it can't be like that. It's like, no, let's go back 10, 15 years or whatever. Microsoft, .NET, closed source. Xamarin, .NET, open source. Where are we now? .NET, open source. Xamarin has won. So, Xamarin took over Microsoft. I'm sure there's very senior people in my company who would be scowling to hear that, but,
Don't worry, we can edit that part out, I'm sure.
Sorry, Mr. Guthrie, I didn't mean to say that. No. I think it's great. It just shows that Miguel was very much ahead of his time in terms of the way he thought about .NET, the fact he thought this should be open, this should be available. And some great people at Microsoft also had the same belief. It just took a bit of time for the great big slow container ship that's Microsoft to slowly spin round. And now Microsoft believes the same thing that Xamarin does, that this should be open source. It should be built out in the open. It should be something that the community is involved in. And I think it's incredible. .NET Core, for example, I think is just phenomenal. The fact that Microsoft is saying, we want to build .NET in the open. We want to make it the best we can with the help of the community. I think is brilliant.
It really is. As we record this, I've recently been editing an episode where I talked to Dave Rayal of Developer on Fire, and we sort of geeked out over the CLI and over .NET Core being so open. And it sparked a conversation I had with someone at work about how the SDK and the runtime for .NET Core are growing so quickly. If you go back in time to early 2001, 2002, and look at the speed at which .NET Framework evolved, it's a snail's pace, considering.
Yeah, it's incredible just how fast it's growing. And so far, we haven't really broken anything bad. That's always the worry when you have something moving quickly, is, are you going to break something? Yeah, Microsoft has been absolutely regimented when it comes to backwards compatibility. But we haven't broken anything with .NET Core that I've seen, which is pretty good. So we've got the right things in place. We've got the right tools in place, the right people in place so that we can iterate much faster and not worry about the problems. Which I think that's phenomenal.
Sure. So here's a hypothetical for you then.
Yep.
There was a lot of talk when .NET Core first came out and people were saying, but what about UIs? You've no UI framework. And that's entirely understandable from the Microsoft Core .NET team's point of view. It would be almost impossible to write a single UI framework that worked across all the platforms. And I think maybe you can see where I'm going with this question. Obviously, .NET Core 3 brings a lot of UWP stuff to Windows only, but it brings some of the UWP, the WPF sort of WinFormsy stuff to Windows only builds for .NET Core. How far out of the question, or is it even out of the question, for me to build a .NET Core app with a Xamarin Forms UI that effectively runs anywhere?
Well, right now, obviously, that's not something we have. But it's interesting you mentioned that. So one thing that's happened with the rise of .NET Core and the growth of Mono, and obviously the lovely coming together that is Xamarin, .NET Core, Xamarin and Microsoft, is that there is a lot of code being shared between Mono and .NET Core. So if you actually look at the kind of breakup of Mono, these are very rough numbers, and somewhere on the Mono GitHub repo, there's all the actual numbers there. But the things like the base class libraries is pretty much a third of it came from Mono originally, a third of it comes from Core, and a third of it comes from the Microsoft reference sources. So there's been code coming from .NET Core into Mono and code coming from Mono into .NET Core. In fact, someone was saying the other day that Mono lifted 120,000 unit tests from .NET Core. Could literally just lift them up, drop them in, and just run them. They all passed. So it feels like there's a great big coming together of the two. I don't know whether there will be one day just one platform. I don't know. But I wouldn't be surprised if one day there is just one platform to rule them all that's made up of .NET Core and Mono. I don't know this for a fact. I'm just totally theorizing here. This is just my opinion. But I feel that one day there will just be this one platform. And then when you've got your core of .NET as it is, which would be .NET Core, you then just pick your platform that goes on top, and you pick WPF or WinForms or UWP or iOS or Android or GTK for Linux, or maybe even Unity will be on there and ASP.NET Core on top of that. And then you think about .NET Forms, is that becomes the natural abstraction that sits on top. So yeah, I can see that happening. Think about, we've got a community-built WPF backend for Xamarin Forms that allows you to run a Xamarin Forms app as a WPF app running on Windows 7. At some point, someone's going to need to update that to support .NET Core and WPF, because that's the future. So, yeah, give it a few years, and my personal thought is there will just be the one .NET Mono core technology, and then, yes, you better spin up a Xamarin Forms app. And using technologies like UI, for example, you could then run that on WebAssembly, and that's obviously built on Xamarin Forms. So you run it on everywhere. So yeah, I can see it happening. Definitely see it happening.
Cool. Because we've had a slight minor controversy on the show before. I just want to point out to listeners, that was Jim's opinion. Mm-hmm. That is not a roadmap. That is not confirmed in any way. That is one person's opinion of the way that things could go. Because we had something similar said on an earlier episode, taken completely out of context. And I saw even Scott Hunter was commenting on it at one point. So that was a bit scary, if I'm honest.
Yeah, no, this is totally my opinion. This is me guessing as to where the future might go. One thing that's very cool, of course, is .NET Core and Mono is being built out in the open. Now, there are some cool things coming in the .NET Core space, which I can't talk about. But I don't know if you know that there's Microsoft Connect coming up on the 4th of December, which is a virtual conference. So it's being streamed from our Channel 9 studios. We've got the two Scotts, the upper Scott and the lesser Scotts. So we have Scott Guthrie doing a keynote talking about the cool stuff in Azure, and then Scott Hanselman talking about some of the great stuff coming up. And there will be a load of stuff on there around the new things that are coming. So if you don't know of Connect, you should check it out. You should watch it. It's going to be live streamed from about 8:30 in the morning Pacific time on the 4th of December. All the videos will be available on demand afterwards, so you can watch them. And one thing that's really cool about this is we're going to be streaming a lot of the sessions over Twitch and Mixer. So there'll be interactive sessions. So when you've got one of the .NET team showing off the new shiny that's coming in .NET Core, you will be able to actually ask some questions and have those questions answered. It's not just going to be watching a video of some person talking. There will be a chance to be interactive. So, yeah, that's December the 4th. If you're UK-based, stay up all night, watch Connect. It's going to be incredible.
I will have to point out, though, that with the way that this episode is scheduled, that will be in the past because of the great Time Machine podcast wibbly-wobbliness.
Okay, so Connect was a few weeks ago, and Connect was lots of great things were announced, which I've completely forgotten and can't tell you about. But
Precisely.
Yes. But no, there's going to be some cool stuff coming at Connect, because there always is cool stuff coming. But yeah, all the stuff around Mono and .NET Core, that's totally my guess as what's going to happen. But .NET Core has been developed in the open. Mono's been developed in the open. The published roadmaps are available. And the numbers, the fact that there's a certain percentage that comes from .NET Core, all that's publicly available. And so you can watch that, see where that goes over time. But I'm very, very excited for the future of Mono and the future of .NET Core. Just because there's things that each platform has, the other one doesn't. Like, for example, the Mono linker. So .NET historically hasn't had a linker. It's just been jittered IL code, whereas Mono's needed a linker so that you can compile to the smallest possible apps to run on iOS and Android. And of course, the Mono linker can then be used on any IL code. So you can, in theory, you can use the Mono linker with .NET Core code to build .NET native apps. So it's just really cool what's happening between those two platforms and the capabilities they both have, because they share a common understanding of IL and a whole lot of commonality between the two.
Can you imagine in the late 90s when all of the people at Microsoft were saying, hey, we need to build this thing. We're not sure what we're going to call it yet, but we're going to eventually call it .NET. We need to build this one thing. And then in 25 years' time, it will be everywhere. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
I don't think they'd have believed you if you told them.
No, and certainly the company culture back in those days, whereas if you said that their core flagship development technology would run on Linux and Apple devices and Google devices and it would be open source, they would have thought you're mad. But that's how it is. It's part of the new way at Microsoft. And that's why Microsoft is becoming such a successful company. Obviously, I don't know what's the state of play is going to be when this episode has gone out, but over the past few days, the stock market has gone a bit crazy, and Microsoft has pipped Apple for the most valuable company in the world for a few minutes here and there, and it's kind of vying for first place. Go back 10 years, that wouldn't have seemed, well, even a year, that would have been unheard of. So the way that Microsoft are doing things these days, the way that we're embracing open source, we're building incredible tools out in the open, and we're putting those tools everywhere, it's just changed the company for the better. And the fact that we've got this one consistent platform, we've got .NET. So if you're a C# or you're an F# or a VB.NET developer, you can put your code anywhere. VB.NET not supported on Xamarin, unfortunately. But if you've got, say, C# code, you can run that inside an Azure function app in the cloud. You can run it in a web app in the cloud. You can run it inside a SQL database on-prem or in the cloud. You can run it on a desktop app, on a website, on a mobile app. You hear Satya talking about ubiquitous computing. It's just stuff that runs everywhere. And yeah, .NET is pretty much the power that does that. You install Java and it says so many billion devices run Java. Well, so many billion devices run .NET. And it's a phenomenal platform. So excited for the future of .NET.
Yeah, I remember, was it last year or the year before? I remember screen capping it for a blog post I wrote. There was a wonderful slide that literally said, .NET anywhere, and it had a picture of the Android logo, the iOS logo, Windows, and a few other logos all around it. And I thought, that's what Java originally promised.
Yeah, Java kind of promised this write once, run everywhere, and to some way it works. And Java is a fantastic language with some great capabilities. I wouldn't say Java UIs have ever been the best, but for server-side code, there's a lot of good stuff, and there are some people who've created some fantastic Java UIs. But .NET also seems to have met that promise, and it's doing it in style. It's got some incredible capabilities. It is definitely that write once, run anywhere technology. And even down to IoT, for example. So I don't know if you've been following, but there's a Kickstarter called Meadow, and they have got an Arduino-style board running .NET. The Kickstarter was literally closed a few hours ago. As we speak, it's closed a few hours ago. There's a company founded by one of the former VPs from Xamarin. And this has got a full .NET standard framework running on an IoT device.
Wow.
So it doesn't matter what you're on, there is .NET for it.
That is amazing. It says on the Kickstarter page, the power of Raspberry Pi and the computing factor of Arduino and the manageability of a mobile app.
Yeah.
That is just, wow. The future is amazing.
Yeah, it is. It's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. And the future is, to me, the future is .NET. To millions and millions of developers, the future is .NET. It's incredible technology. I honestly can't see why you wouldn't want to be a .NET developer. Scott Hanselman often says that now is the best time to be a developer, and you can say that every single day. But now and .NET is definitely the best place to be a developer.
Yeah, definitely.
Exciting times, isn't it? It is exciting times.
It really is. It really is. So a couple of shorter questions before we sign off then, if that's okay.
Yep.
So what was the name of the book again, sorry?
So the book I wrote is called Xamarin in Action. It's published by Manning. If you want to buy a copy, if you head to zam.jbb.io, then that will take you to the Manning website. If you use the code Xamarin in Action, all one word, lowercase, you'll get a substantial discount. It's about 40%, I think it is, which is pretty cool. Now, the whole premise of Xamarin in Action is to take somebody who's got some C# knowledge, a few months minimum, but take them from zero to a full mobile app. So it focuses on Xamarin Native rather than Xamarin Forms, and focuses on a deep understanding of the MVVM design pattern, how you can use this to build mobile apps and share your code between the two platforms, and then how you actually design a mobile app, think about the user experience of a mobile app, and then build it, understand the way mobile works, understand things like SDK versions, the structure of a mobile application. You then create your app. It uses Visual Studio App Center to do things like analytics, crash reporting, testing. It's got the whole thing on user interface testing using the Xamarin UI test tooling. And then it's get your app, distribute to testers, test it out, and actually deploy it to the stores. So it's the idea being that you can build a complete Xamarin app, understand the architecture, build it and deploy it, from back of a napkin idea to the store, all in one. Rather than just being, here's an API reference for stuff, it's the actual underlying architecture, mobile paradigms, absolutely everything, so you can take an app and ship it.
Wow, okay. I like that. I like the idea behind the in-action books because, like you say, you could have completely different situation, but if you look at the C# in Depth by John Skeet, that's very much a case of here are some incredibly detailed descriptions of parts of the spec, which are useful, but not if you're building a CRUD app.
Yeah.
Yeah, whereas the in-action books are, here is an idea for an app. Let's go through the process of creating the entire thing and how you would, like you say, how you would build unit tests and CI/CD and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's one thing I think Manning does really well is it pigeonholes the different books into the appropriate place for them. So their in-action series is, I want to get started, I want to build something, I want to understand what I'm building. And then the in-depth series is, right, now you know what you're doing, let's dig in deeper so you can learn about the hard things, how to do things better. So there's kind of a place for both series of books. It's like when I first start with something I want in action, as I know more, I want in depth. So Manning do that very well. And I must admit, Manning, they're a phenomenal publisher. Just the amount of effort they put into making sure their writers are good writers. So I hate to think how many hours of training from my editor about how to write a book before they even let me write my first chapter. And then so many reviews, so many editorial teams, so many technical editors, technical correctness checkers. The book is not a cheap one. Manning are not those companies that will do every day there's another book for $5. They are really good quality books. They put a lot of effort into them. So I'm really proud to have written a book for Manning. And I like to think my book is quite good. And I've heard some good reviews, so I'm sure other people think the same thing.
It's definitely on my list of the next book to buy from Manning is that one. Because I have, like I said at the beginning, I have the .NET Core in Action and the ASP.NET Core in Action. Next one is Xamarin in Action. And then there's like microservices in action. And I'm just going to have the whole collection and be the envy of everyone I work with. And I can be like, yes, I can be the person who goes into work and goes, yes, you're doing ASP.NET. Here's what you need to do. You're doing Xamarin. Here's what you need to do.
Yeah, I would love to have a whole shelf of those, but I'm not allowed to have lots of books. I did have a lot of programming books, and I was quietly encouraged to dispose of them.
Okay, so where can people go to find out more about you and the work you're doing and all that kind of stuff?
So the best place to find out more about me is on the Twitters. So my Twitter handle is Jim Bob Bennett. So I'm on there. My DMs are open. You can ping me, ask me any questions you want. I blog at jimbobbennett.io. So I've got a blog there. I blog regularly about Xamarin and Azure-based things. If you want to come meet me, see me at a conference, I'm going to be at NDC London at the end of January. I'm giving a talk there on Fabulous, which is the F# model view update style architecture that sits on top of Xamarin Forms. So I'll be there. Come and hang out. Come see my session, or DM me on Twitter if you want to meet up for a beer. Other than that, we're taking some of great Microsoft Azure content on tour. So we have a thing called Microsoft Ignite the Tour. We've got, I think it's either 14 or 17 stops where all around the world, where we've got other cloud advocates like me showing off some great things. We've got some fantastic learning paths. So you can come along and say, for example, you want to deploy a web app. We will take you through the whole process throughout a day. So rather than just lots of different disparate talks, it's a whole flow you can go through depending on what you want to learn, with phenomenal people presenting. I'm probably going to be in Singapore, Seoul, Washington, and London for that. That's still to be confirmed. But otherwise, there's cool people like me going to be at these various stops. So just Google Microsoft Ignite the Tour to find out what's going on there. That's an Azure-focused thing rather than a Xamarin-focused thing. Now, other than that, I'm usually on the conference circuit or on the various meetups. So if you want me to come to your conference or your meetup and talk about Xamarin, just get in touch.
Fantastic. We were talking just slightly off air about recording and the software that I use to record. And you mentioned that you have a podcast. Is this something that is a going concern, or is this on hold? Or
So it's a little bit on hold. I created the Gym and Tonic show, where I was just chatting to other cloud advocates that I work with. And I did about 8 episodes, and I haven't done any more since. So I do need to reboot that podcast at some point. You can check it out. It's on iTunes and all the various other podcasting apps. So it's called the Gym and Tonic show. And yeah, I haven't done anything for a while. I desperately need to reboot it, and you've now publicly shamed me. So,
well, maybe this can be you saying publicly it may or may not be rebooted.
But yes, my New Year's resolution is to try and record a whole lot more episodes and get some more out there.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, yeah, that's all the questions that I have for this chat. I just want to say thank you ever so much, Jim, for being on the show. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. I've learned so much about Xamarin just in the 50 minutes we've been talking. It's amazing.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a lot of fun. And as you can tell, I never get bored talking about Xamarin. So if anyone else wants to get bored senseless by me talking about Xamarin, just send me a Twitter DM and I'll talk your ears off.
Well, there you go, listeners. You've been told. Bye-bye inbox is what I'll say. Thank you ever so much, Jim. It's been fantastic talking to you.
Thanks.
That was my interview with Jim Bennett. Be sure to check the show notes for a bunch of links to some of the stuff that we covered and a full transcription of the interview. The show notes, as always, can be found at .netcore.show. And don't forget to spread the word. Leave me a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice, and to come back next time for more .NET Core goodness. I'll see you again real soon. See you later, folks.